This video is a continuation of my ongoing project to recreate Danielle de Barberac's ball gown from the 1998 film Ever After. Please check the description box for previous episodes. If you remember where I left off on the last video, I was less than satisfied with the silk satin underskirt, so I began this workday by seam ripping it almost completely back apart. My fingers are literally sore from seam ripping. When I was back down to just the skirt front and two backs, I lined them up again and pinned the side seams. If you remember, last time I lined up the bias with the straight grain seams, hoping to keep the hem from stretching. That did not work at all, so this time I'm pinning it bias to bias. I also will not be reinserting the pockets. They aren't really necessary for this project, and I didn't like the bulk and the lines that they added to the skirt. I also sewed the back seam up again with the same 2 inches of seam allowance to give the dress potential for size adjustments in the future. After the skirt was done, again, I pinned it onto my dress form and stuck it up on a pedestal. Not as an item of worship, but to let the hem hang freely and stretch out as much as it needs to. I will not be starting the padding again today or even anytime soon. I want to give it as much time as possible to fully stretch out before I trim it down and start all of those crazy French knots. Instead, I think it's time to switch gears onto something that I am more familiar with: patterning the bodice. Let's check our source, shall we? The original bodice has a center and side front, and a center and side back. The back looks like a fairly standard princess seam, covered by trim that flows smoothly into the shoulder strap. The front seam curves over the bust into a V at the center, with no additional darts. The waistline of this dress is raised, but it's actually not that high. It certainly isn't as high as a Regency gown. It also doesn't have the straight structure of a Renaissance gown either. However, this is a fantasy gown, not strictly limited to inspiration from one historical time period, so let's just keep that in mind. The waistline has a gentle curve that I absolutely love. So subtle, but so much more interesting than if the seam simply sat straight. Was it designed and cut that way, or is the curve the result of the dress slipping down? There is definitely a difference between the way the dress looks in the movie and how it looks on display. It sat lower when Drew Barrymore was actually wearing it. The sleeves are off-shoulder and the waistline sits maybe 2 inches below the bust. When you see it on a mannequin, the sleeves are on the shoulders and the waistline usually sits higher. The question is the mannequin correct and the dress was simply slipping down when Drew wore it, or was the way Drew wore it how the costumers intended it to sit and the mannequin dressers simply adjust it to fit the mannequin better? That I don't know. Patterning this one ought to be simpler than most of my projects because I can actually drape it. I did make the corset with basically the exact neckline, arm size, and strap shape that I want the dress to have, so that will make things easier. Basically, I'd already sketched on the corset approximately where I thought the seams should go, so I pinned a scrap of fabric to it, lining up a straight grain edge with the center front seam of the corset. I traced the bust seam and the neckline, smoothing them out, and then unpinned them, and here's what I got. Laying flat, I trimmed the piece and labeled it, and then pinned it back onto the dress form so that I could use that seam to line up the next piece. This time I lined up the straight grain with the waistline that I had sketched out. I smoothed the fabric out and pinned all of the edges, and then I traced the bust seam and the side seam and the arm side. It's basically the exact same process with the back piece. I'm only trying to get the gist of it. The pieces aren't perfect, and they're definitely wonky in places, but that's okay. We're just trying to get a basic pattern that we can refine through mock-ups. And here's what my initial draped pattern looked like. I traced all of those pieces onto paper, adding seam allowances and extra width in the back, since the corset had a lacing gap and I want 2 inches of extra seam allowance on top of that. But by that time it was evening, and so that's it for day 7. Here's how my first mock-up turned out. I mean, for such a rough draft, it's pretty good. The seams and edges are all mostly lined up, but there are a few things that need tweaked. I forgot that the bust seam needs to curve down and meet the lower edge of the shoulder strap, not the upper edge, because that's the line that the trim will follow later on. The same thing needs tweaked in the back. I also think the back seam needs to curve in a bit closer to the center back, and the arm's eyes seem wide, at least compared to the corset. So that needs to be brought in a bit. But I noticed that it seemed loosed mostly in the front, which made me think that maybe it just needed to be pinched in at the bust seam, like when you add a dart or contour a neckline. Okay, here's how I changed those front pieces. I drew a line curving over a little bit further here, and it meets right at that corner, but there's also a little bit of a slice that I'm going to take out there just to kind of dart it in just a little bit more. And then when I cut off this side, I'm going to attach it to this piece. And then at the lower portion of it, I also decided to edit it a little bit. I straightened out this line here instead of it curving in. And then also I'm going to be removing a little bit from the lower line down here to make up the difference. It just looks a little bit too wide at the bottom portion of the bodice right now. Okay, here's what the altered bodice front pieces look like. This has been angled down and joined up with the front piece, which perfectly matches the strap now. I also curved down the waistline about 1/2 inch, and then on the back pieces I'm going to add a straight 1/2 inch to the bottom of the waistline. I love the gentle slope that has started to develop along that bottom edge, but I want to exaggerate it just a little bit more, and I want the entire waistline to be just a little bit lower. So now for the back pieces, I added a 1/2 inch to the bottom edge. I curved this line in pretty far right here and then brought it out on this piece. I curved the entire line because it kind of had gotten a bit uneven, so I kind of refreshed the curve and then matched it up over here. I had to extend this and bring it in a bit more because when I pinched it out, it kind of didn't line up anymore. It's all a bit crazy and confusing, but I think it's right. I'm going to do a second mock-up now. Okay, first one wasn't that bad, but this one's actually much better. So the curve definitely had an effect down at the lower edge. I really like how that looks. It's a little bit narrowed in right here, which is good. It's not quite as drastically wide, but it's a little bit wider up here, and it lines up perfectly with the edge of the strap. So when I apply the trim right here, it'll just go smoothly from one to the next. It fits the armhole much better. It's just a little bit pinched in, a little bit contoured, and yeah, it's not gaping anymore. And then in the back, this seam, it just has a much nicer curve. It comes in a lot closer to the back, and then it again curves up and then smoothly lines up with the edge of that. I am really happy with this. I just need to actually try it on myself now, so I think I'm going to add a zipper to it and then do that. The fit is pretty much exactly replicating the fit of the corset. It does the exact dip up that I wanted. It's not terribly wrinkled. The back of it is a little bit loose kind of at the top. And I think that maybe the back neckline could be raised entirely. Just a little bit, maybe almost an inch actually, at least half an inch. It is raised above my natural waistline, but it's not, you know, way up in Regency land. It's kind of just this nice in between, which is about exactly what I was after. Everything lines up pretty well. It's what I was going for. So yeah, the back is a little bit difficult and I can't really see very well, especially not with the corset. It's not too bad though. What I might do is raise it, but also kind of dip it, like curve it just a little bit to just kind of curve around the shape of my back a little bit better. But yeah, everything else seems pretty much good to go. Alright, here it is. Final adjustment. I just raised the back neckline by an inch and then tapered it in. I think that will look much better. Now, as far as sloping the center back seam, I don't think I should do that yet because I am cutting it with a very generous amount of excess. I think what I'm going to do is just leave that alone for now, and then when I finally put in the closure at the very end, I will kind of have somebody come and help me and fit it to me and taper it in manually. And it will just be the closure that's tapered. All of this excess will still remain. So, I guess what I'm ready to do now is cut it out of some plain white cotton to make my inner lining. All right, ready to go. Okay, going to be cutting this inner lining bodice out of the cotton sheeting that I've been using for the petticoat and the skirt mock-ups and all of those other things. I really probably ought to add that to my cost breakdown. I did buy it specifically for this project, I just forgot about it. So these pieces are all going to be cut from this, however the center front will not be. I am holding off on that one, and let me explain. Okay, so the center front. On the Ever After Costuming website, someone who saw the dress in person said that it looked to them like the center front was sheer beneath the lace and appliques. They said that they could see the muslin fabric of the dress form right through it. That is a very interesting idea. I think having a super subtle sheerness, almost but not quite covered by all of the lace and embroidery, I think it would add a lot of depth and dimension to the center panel, so much more than a simple satin lining would. However, my question about this is, if they could see through the bodice, why didn't they see the corset? We know what it looks like and that there is at least this strap which you should be able to see through the dress. Maybe they weren't seeing the muslin of the dress form, maybe the dress was simply lined with something similar to muslin, I don't know. For my dress, I've decided that for now, I am going to cut this center panel from my organza overlay fabric. If I decide to make it opaque later, there will be plenty of opportunity to add another layer. But if I decide later that I'd rather make it more sheer, it will be much more difficult to do so. I may need to change something with the corset, like maybe inserting a panel where it would show through, but I'm also low-key thinking that I might completely remake the corset down the line from the leftover Duchess satin. If I do that, I could easily add sheer panels like the original has. Or maybe I won't, we'll see. Either way, I just want to leave my options open right now. Okay, to make this inner lining bodice, I'm going to stitch the side seams and the side back seams, and it will look like this. Then I'm going to sew one side of the bust seam, but make sure that I stop right at the center front and back tack, rather than sewing all the way to the selvage. Then, when I stitch the other side, I'm going to fold the seams out of the way and start from the same point. When it's laid flat, it looks like this, with that end all loose and dangling. Clipped the curved seams and then fold the bodice down the center front and pin the loose ends together. So here, stopping right where it meets with the previous 2 lines of stitching. Clip out a small triangle, and now when you open it up, everything will lay flat and smooth. I took it to the ironing board and ironed all of the seams. The side seams I opened, and the back seams I ironed facing the center back, as this is where the trim will be placed. And I ironed the bust seams towards the center front for the same reason. Now it's looking good, and I just need to add the straps. To make this easier, I started by tracing the seam allowance onto each edge with a water-soluble marker. Then I ironed up the bottom edge of each strap along the 1/2-inch marking. I placed it on the bodice, lining up the markings where they met with the back seam. And then I did the same with the front of the strap. I stitched down the strap back, and then kept sewing right around the arm's eye curve and stitched up the other side. Now let's take a step back and see what we're looking at. Okay, the strap looks pretty solid. Now I'm going to clip around the curve of the arm's eye and then take it to the machine and baste the raw edges under, and baste down the strap seam allowance while I'm at it. Then I ran another line of basting up the back seam, over the bottom of the strap, down the bust seam, pivoting, and then going up along the other side. I decided to baste and turn under the top edge too. I'm not sure if I'll want to leave it that way along the front neckline, but for now it will keep everything in place and help mitigate the fraying. Okay, so last time I got to work on this, I finished this inner bodice and then I started pinning it to the petticoat skirt. I ran out of time before I got a chance to sew it, but I realized that that's a good thing because I was about to totally screw it up. There's 2 reasons this won't work. One, I measured the length of the petticoat to be roughly right at the underbust, but this is definitely longer, but I'm not sure exactly how much because I was just holding it up to myself wearing my normal clothes, not the corset, which gives me a different shape, so I'm honestly not sure where it's going to need to sit. The other reason is that this dips up, so I need to correct for that from the top, kind of like how 18th century skirts are corrected. So what I'm going to do is unpin it, but preserve the pleats I made, and instead I'm just going to pin the silk satin skirt to it and baste it in place. I might need to take it out later, but I want something very smooth and solid for it to hang from so that the hem can stretch out and I can come back and trim it even later. So I think I'm going to call it quits for here with this video because, I don't know, it just feels like a good stopping place. The next thing I probably really need to start is there's just one thing I wanted to point out. Do you see how the skirt is flared, so it's smooth up top, but then lower down it starts to develop these nice folds and creases. However, there's one very strong crease going almost all the way to the top. That, I believe, is caused by the dip up, kind of pulling that fabric up a little bit and kind of throwing off the hang. However, I'm really excited about that because the original dress had the exact same kind of predominant central front crease. So that's pretty cool. Okay, review. First off, I'd like to retcon, if I can, some of my disappointment at the end of the last video. Seeing the skirt in 3D, it's fine. It will work. It's fine. Yes, there is some discoloration in the dye job, but it's so faint that I can barely even get it to show up on camera, so I will be fine, it will be fine, and I will allow myself to move on. Also, the overall color. I wasn't too thrilled with it at first, it just seemed lighter than I thought it should be, but seeing it now, I think it's basically perfect. Soft pearl gray, just a shade off from white. The color I arrived at also looks lovely with my silver overlay organza, which was technically the whole point in dyeing it. So, take a deep breath, it's okay, it's going to turn out fine. Next, what are my critiques so far? With this bodice, the reason that I wanted to do an inner lining is because I'm now thinking that I will not be building the dress directly onto the corset. I want the ability to swap out the corset later if I make a better one. So this lightweight cotton will give the satin just a tiny bit of structure and strength without making it too stiff. At least, that's the theory. I'm really happy with the fit of the bodice. I think my only critique at this point is that maybe I should have made the straps from organza as well. If I do end up going with a sheer center, it would give such a beautifully smooth transition to the lace and trims later on. So I might go back and seam rip just the straps and replace them. But other than that, there's actually nothing that I'm really dissatisfied with right now. Next point. I figured it out. I figured out how a bias cut skirt is supposed to skim narrow hips. Okay, here's the physics of it. If you have a bias cut skirt, the grain line of the fabric will hang like this. This will draw down the center of the skirt, giving a little bit of tension to the fabric over the sides. This will bring it in just a little, helping a high-waisted skirt to cling to the natural waist and make it subtly more flattering. So, that finally makes sense to me. Of course, it's too late for me to change my skirt now, but I'm okay with mine being on the straight grain. I have a short waist, which is usually annoying, but with this dress, it means that I only have a couple of inches between my waistline and my natural waist, so it's not really going to make a huge difference in the fit. If you are not short-waisted though, I can definitely see this bias cut making a bigger difference on you. And the other reason that I'm content with my choice is that I still don't want to risk my front hem stretching out over time like the original dress did. If anything is going to stretch, I would rather it be the sides. And the last thing that I wanted to discuss was some of the comments from the previous video. I used to do this with my world building videos and it was really fun. It works well with long multi-stage projects like this. So let's see what we've got. Just FYI, the mm doesn't stand for millimeters. It stands for mom, which is a measure of the weight of the fabric. 20 mom is a nice light but opaque silk, and 18 to 13 mom is generally silk chiffon. 40 mom would be pretty stiff, probably good for a structured wedding dress. I just never knew that and wanted to share. The 40 mom satin that I have is definitely thick, but I wouldn't call it stiff. It is very heavy with an excellent drape, so I am happy with my choice in that, even though it was booty expensive. A few different people told me that the wooden drying rack might be what caused the yellowing to the satin. In this case, it's not. My drying rack has a wooden frame but plastic dowel rods, and also the places with the heaviest yellowing were where there were wrinkles or folds in the fabric. But if you are interested in dyeing, that is good to know. I must say that it is reassuring to see someone as prolific as you screw up. You are welcome, I guess. I would definitely redo those side seams bias to bias and see if the pockets behave better when the drape is consistent. If not, you can always make a matching wrist bag for necessities. Thank you for that reminder. I actually already have a little silver vintage beaded bag that would be perfect, so maybe I'll just use that. This comment you can pause and read if you want. It was about how to properly calculate tiny portions of dye. I appreciate it, and I'm sure it will help someone out there, but personally, the numbers and exactness were exactly what was stressing me out, and I was only able to venture forth and actually dye the fabric once I had enough practice with the samples to feel comfortable winging it. So do what works for you. I was surprised by the number of people who suggested that I do it again. I thought people would be horrified by the expense of the fabric, but apparently not. I've never heard anyone pronounce Duchess that way. I said Duchess. I'm fairly sure that it's pronounced the same way as the noble rank. I don't know. Can we get some more votes? I thought I heard it pronounced that way on somebody else's video, but maybe they were wrong too. Crepe de chine is not the same as crepe back satin, unfortunately. Okay, I stand corrected. Maybe there wasn't that much cheaper of an option available then. When I have to stitch straight and non-straight grain, I baste it in hanging position. Well, that would have been a good idea. Okay, that's it for this video. I think the next priority will be starting the organza overskirt, so I will see you next time.